There is not a British rocker or on earth who could ever turn Jack Scott's chorus line. Lonesome Mary's cutting out. Hate to be around when Johnny finds this out. Into anything approximating a convincing statement. But while we can thus describe or assume general patterns of musical taste and use, the precise fit or homology between sounds and social groups remains unclear, which is why common sense sociology has had to deploy its second set of arguments about the match of music's formal and social functions. This approach is most sophisticated in ethnomusicology, in anthropological studies of traditional and folk musics, which are explained musically, in terms of their formal and sonic qualities, by reference to their use in dance in rituals for political mobilization, to solemnized events. Similar points are made about contemporary popular music, though its most important social functions is assumed to be commercial. The starting analytical assumption is that the music is made to sell. Research focuses on how makes marketing decisions and why, on the construction of taste and taste publics. The appeal of the music itself, the reason why people like it, and what, more importantly, liking it means, is buried under the analysis of sales strategies, demographics, the anthropology of consumption. From the consumer's perspective, though, it is obvious that people play the music they do because it sounds good. And even if musical tastes are inevitably an effect of social conditions and commercial manipulation, people still explain them to themselves in terms of something special. Everyone in the pop world is aware of the social forces that determine normal pop music and normal pop tastes. But a good record or song or sound is precisely one that transcends those forces. From this perspective, pop music becomes the more valuable aesthetically, the more independent it is of the social forces that organize it. And one way of reading this is to suggest that pop values is thus dependent on something outside pop, is rooted in the person, the author, the community, or the subculture that lies behind it. Critical judgment means measuring performers to the experience or feelings they are describing or expressing. The problem is that it is in practice very difficult to say who or what it is that pop music expresses or how we recognize independently on their music the authentically recreative performers. Musical truth is precisely that which is created by good music. We hear the music as authentic, or rather, we describe the musical experience we value in terms of authenticity. And such a response is then read back spuriously onto the music making or listening process. An aesthetic judgment of effects is translated into a sociological description of cause. Good music must be music made by and appreciated by good people. But the question we should be asking is not what does popular music reveals about the people who play and use it, but how does it create them as a people? as a web of identities. If we start from the assumption that pop is expressive, then we get bogged down in the search for the real artistic or emotion beliefs lying behind it. But popular music is popular not because it reflects something or authentically articulates some sort of popular taste of or experience, but because it creates our understanding of what popularity is, because it places us in the social world in a particular way. What we should be examining, in other words, is not how true a piece of music is to something else, but how it sets up the idea of truth in the first place. Successful pop music is music which defines its own aesthetic standard. The imagine itself. The experience of pop music is an experience of identity. In responding to a song, we are drawn haphazardly into emotional alliances with the performers and with the performers. With the performers and with the performers. Well, it's the same. Other fans, because of its qualities of abstractness, music is by nature an individualizing form. We absorb songs into our own lives and rhythm into our own bodies. They have a looseness of reference that makes them immediately accessible. At the same time, and equally significantly, music is obviously collective. We hear things as music because their sound obey a more or less similar cultural logic. And for most music listeners who are not themselves music makers, this logic is out of our control. There is a mystery to our own musical tastes. Some records and performers work for us, others do not. We know this without being able to explain it. Somebody else has set up the conventions. They are clearly social and clearly apart from us. Music, whether teeny bop for young female fans, or jazz or rap for African Americans, or 19th century chamber music for German Jews in Israel, stand for, symbolizes, and offers the immediate experience of collective identity. If narrative is the basis of multiple pleasures, of music pleasures, to put this another way, it is also central to our sense of identity. Identity, that is to say, comes from the outside, not the inside. It is something we put or try on, not something we reveal or discover. As Jonathan Rhee puts it, the problem of personal identity, one may say, arises from play acting and the adoption of artificial voices. The origins of distinct personalities in acts of personations and impersonations, and Rhee goes on to argue that personal identity is therefore the accomplishment for a storyteller rather than the attribute of character. He draws on Sartre and Ricoeur in suggesting that narrative is the unity of a life, not something achieved through something essential to some essential continuity, but rather to a recurring belief in personal coherence, the belief necessarily renewed in the telling of tales. The concept of narrative, in other words, is not so much a justification of the idea of personal identity as an elucidation of its structure as an inescapable piece of make-believe. This argument has two immediate implications. First, identities are inevitably shaped according to narrative forms. As Kwame Anthony Appiah points out, invented histories, invented biologies, invented cultural affinities come with every identity. Each is a kind of role that has to be scripted, structured by conventions of narrative to which the world never quite managed to conform. But if identity is always somehow constrained by imaginative forms, it is also freed by them. The personal is the cultural, and Mark Sulobin suggests we are not necessarily restricted in terms of such cultural imagination by social circumstances. We all grow up with something, but we can choose about anything by way of expressive culture. In broad terms, we may be able to release social and cultural identities to finger social and cultural theft. The blackface performer, writes Eric Lott, is in effect a perfect metaphor of one culture's ventriloquial self-expression through the art forms of someone else's. But at an individual level, biology, demography, and sociology seem less determining. As I have argued elsewhere, with reference to literary forms and social identities, black writing, women's writing, gay writing, etc., the question is not simple whether such writing can be mapped back onto the reader, reading as a woman, as a man, a black, but whether literary transformation, the process of writing and reading, doesn't subvert all sociological assumptions about cultural position and cultural feeling. And this seems an even more obvious question about popular music, of which dominant forms in all contemporary societies have originated at the social margins. Among the poor, the migrant, the rootless, the queer, anti-essentialism is a necessary part of musical experience, a necessary consequence of music's failure to register the separations of body and mind on which such essential differences between black and white, female and male, gay and straight, nation and nation depend. Hence Paul Gilroy's skepticism about rap nationalism. How does a form which flaunts and glories in its own malleability as well as its transnational character become interpreted as an expression of some authentic Afro-American essence? If Gilroy remembers that growing up he was provided by black music with a means to gain proximity to the sources of feeling from which our local conception of blackness were assembled, he also realizes that the most important lesson music still has to teach us is that its inner secrets and its ethnic rules can be taught and learned. And as a child and young man, I also learned something of myself, took my identity from black music, just as I did later in the disco from gay music. What secret was I being taught? First, that an identity is always already an ideal, what we an ideal what we could like to be, not where we are. And in taking pleasure from black or gay or female music, I don't thus identify as black or gay or female. I don't actually experience these sounds of as black music or gay music or women's voices, but rather participate in imagined forms of democracy and desire. The aesthetic, as Colin Campbell has argued, these days describes a quality of experience rather than a state of being, and the popular aesthetic experience is an effect of modern autonomous imaginative hedonism. The pleasure which self-illusory hedonism supplies are largely aesthetic and emotional, the senses created in imagination having the characteristics of both works of art and drama. In this classic account of the presentation of self in everyday life, Irving Goffman does emphasize Simone de Beauvoir's point that in this dressing and making up a woman does not present herself to observation. She is like the picture of the statue or the actor on stage, an agent through whom is suggested someone not there, that is the character that she represents but is not. It is this identification with something unreal, fixed, perfect, as the hero of a novel, as a portrait or a bust, that gratifies her. She strives to identify herself with this figure and thus to seem to herself to be stabilized, justified in her splendor. But if musical identity is then always fantastic, idealizing not just oneself but also the social world one inhabits, it is secondly always also real, enacted in musical activities, music making and music listening. That is to say, our bodily matters involve and one might call social movements. In these respects, musical pleasure is not derived from fantasy. It is not mediated by daydreams, but is experienced directly. Music gives us a real experience of what the ideal could be. In his discussion of black identity, Paul Gilroy thus argues that it is neither simply a social and political category, nor a vague and utterly contingent construction, but remains the outcome of practical activity, language, gesture, bodily significations, desires. These significations are condensed in musical performance, although it does not, of course, monopolize them. In this context, they produce the imaginary effect of an internal racial core or essence by acting on the body through the specific mechanisms of identification and recognition that are produced in the intimate interaction of performer and crowd. This reciprocal relationship serves as a strategy and an ideal communicative situation, even when the original makers of the music and its eventual consumers are separated in space and time or divided by the technologies of sound production and the commodity form which their art has sought to resist. And once we start looking at different musical genres, we are bound to document the different ways in which music works materially to give people different identities, to place them in different social groups. Whether we are talking about Finnish dance halls in Sweden, Irish pubs in London, or Indian film music in Trinidad, we are dealing not just with nostalgia for traditional sounds, not just with a commitment to different songs, but also with experience or alternative modes of social interactions. Communal values can only thus be grasped as musical aesthetics in action. Helen Myers, for example, quotes Shanu, a village singer in Felicity, Trinidad.